So if you would join me in welcoming Professor Ohlson.
Well, thank you for inviting me here. It's very nice. I have 10 minutes, and of course I'm going to talk on the same topic as Xiao Zhong as to equity valuation and accounting data, and in the context of financial statement analysis. And what I will try to do during these 10 minutes is sort of speak to exactly the same issues in 10 minutes, and what I like to do is just to emphasize what I find important. And so that's what all I'm going to try to do. I'm going to just sort of make a number of different points. So let's start out with what's going on here. And this is just my way of thinking about it. And when I think about valuation, I always think it in terms of practice. And practice starts from the simple observation that investors tend to, as a first cut, investors tend to focus on the price-forward earnings ratio, and then their thinking is that the growth in earnings should explain the price-forward earnings ratio. So there's nothing really radical about this. And I certainly would claim that as a first-cut approach, that's what people use in practice. Now, why is this very interesting? Well, what's interesting about it is, if you read the finance textbooks, you never ever see really a reference to this problem. And basically what you have in mind, of course, if you grant with the first slide here, the second slide that should come up is that we should try to educate our audiences as to what this is all about. And one thing we can do is sort of plot the price-forward earnings ratio and the growth in expected earnings and sort of start to think about it. It turns out that in accounting, when you look at accounting textbooks, it's very, very, very rare that you ever see this graph. And the one I picked up on here is from Steve's textbook. However, it should be noted it's the third edition. Editions 1 and 2 did not have the same graph. But it seems to me that's a very important point. If we want to teach useful information about equity valuation, we have to come to grips in explaining how the price-forward earnings ratio relates to earnings growth or the growth in expected earnings. Of course, you're not going to get a perfect graph. And so you sort of have, fortunately, because otherwise we wouldn't have much to teach. But, there are all sorts of things lurking in the background. Risk, and then all sorts of errors in expected earnings. What I have in mind in particular is the possibility that if you use analyst expected earnings, they're not sort of properly updated, but there are numerous other kinds of errors in expected earnings. But then also in the background we have a notion of long-term growth in expected earnings too. And finally, a sort of, the ultimate catch in all of this analysis at some level is sort of a notion of market efficiency. So that's sort of really, something I think is very worthwhile to emphasize from a point of view where we're heading in the long run. To what extent do we want to teach the fact that the price-earnings ratio should be explained by growth in earnings? It's amazing how little research there has been in this area. And, working around here, I have there are two people who have actually done something about it. Jake Thomas, and then we have Ted Stugianis. They actually sort of look into this problem. But otherwise, if anything, it's really quite astounding as to how little has been looked into this thing. Now, then it turns out, of course, that there's a much, much, much more popular plot, which you find in most textbooks. And it has to do with the idea that somehow the company's profitability should relate to the market-to-book ratio. And, of course, that's sort of part of the previous talk. So you can, so people prepare these plots here, and the idea here is that profitable firms should have high market-to-book ratio. And then you can motivate that, which is very unfortunate in some sense, by RIV, but perhaps a little bit better, you can motivate it by the market-to-book is equal to the formula that was presented earlier. In other words, under suitable assumptions, the market-to-book ratio is going to be the return on common equity minus the growth in the normal earnings divided by blah, blah, blah. So you can get this kind of a relationship here. Now, what is important about this? Well, what's important about this is actually, it relates to a true story that I experienced. I only taught RIV and this once in my life, and I'm glad I only did it once. And that was about 10 years ago, so I sort of showed something very similar in the classroom. This was at Columbia University. I had a bunch of MBA students. And after class, a student came up to me, and he wanted to argue with me. And his argument was, it took me some time since I picked up on, but basically what he said is the following thing. Well, you have the same denominator on the two coordinates. So you have the market to book is divided by the book value. Return on common equity is divided by the book value. And as academicians, we sort of know roughly what happens. So I sort of picked up on that, although it took me some time because I was kind of a defensive. But then he said, and this is sort of a crucial thing here, the graph is going to look very good as long as the cross-sectional variation in the price-forward earnings ratio is low. Under ideal circumstances, if expected earnings is just proportional to price, in other words, you can think about expected earnings as being 10% of price, then this graph is going to look perfect. But it's going to look perfect no matter what denominator you pick. So the point here is that what this really tells you, that the starting point in all of equity analysis has to be by understanding the price-to-forward earnings ratio. If you don't have that laid out, there's no way we're going to go. So that's sort of what you learn from this graph. Focus first on the price-forward earnings ratio. And then, from a point of view theory, we have something very, very simple. And it has to do with the fact that, actually it's not written the way it's supposed to be. We have the idea that the price-forward earnings ratio, capitalized being the same thing, is really the same thing as a statement, and you have to rewrite this a little bit, that the growth in earnings is due solely to earnings retained. These are two identical statements. If a growth in earnings is due entirely to retained earnings, then and only then are you going to find out that capitalized forward earnings are going to be equal to the price. So they're sort of two sides of the same coin. This works for sort of any reasonable dividend policy. This is just the mathematics of a savings account, of course. But it's probably one of the more crucial ideas in all of accounting. The price-forward earnings ratio is equal to the inverse of the cost of capital if and only if the growth in earnings is due to retained earnings. So if you have 100% payout, growth extrapolates. This is permanent earnings. If you have a zero payout, then growth in earnings is determined solely by the cost of capital. So these are two sides of the same coin. Once you appreciate this model, which is a model in two variables, then you have to ask the question, what is the model that comes next? So you're really moving from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions, and basically as a matter of conjecture, you're looking for something that goes beyond the simple model. So you can think about it, I'm looking for x2. What is x2? And x2 has to be some complement, and reasonably you can conjecture that it has to do with growth in earnings that goes beyond what's inherent in retained earnings. In other words, we're trying to add another dimension to the basic model, which is sort of a permanent earnings model. You can also think in terms of x1, but on the basis of observation of sort of how investment is done in practice, it's sort of a very reasonable conjecture that this is really going to revolve. We're going to capture growth. And we're going to capture growth the way we want it, which is what is the growth in earnings or expected earnings that goes beyond retained earnings. So this is something I like to emphasize. Now, once you see this here, then of course, this is the first time ever I have this kind of 3-color slide. But it's a first for everything. So now you notice here that if you know the workings of permanent earnings, in other words, the mathematics of a savings account, if you're researching and trying to make a living, what is the next step? Well, it's fairly easy to see that in the absence of a ZT, that's just the savings account in action. So what's sort of the simplest possible extension? Well, add on something and let it grow. Add on something and let it grow. And then, of course, as usual, we can always have a dividend policy. Now, if you make this assumption here, which I think about as an attempt to move from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions, then, and as it turns out, and only then, do you end up with the so-called OJ model. That, in my mind, is the proper way of thinking about the OJ model. It takes you from 2 dimensions, or the permanent earnings model, to 3 dimensions. And it does it in the simplest possible fashion. So now I have an answer to my x1 and x2. And that's, of course, in other words, if you want to go beyond the simplest model, then you can think about it in two different ways, which is sort of the same way. Of course, in the previous preparation was the first line, but for teaching purposes, I tend to use, if I teach it, hypothetically, then it would be the second expression. So basically, I'm sort of looking for a correction factor, and the greater the growth in earnings, long-term growth in earnings, and short-term growth in earnings, the more of a correction I need. So it sort of works from that point of view, which is kind of nice. So that's sort of the basic. Now, and that's sort of the point that needs to be emphasized here, is that we cannot expect to understand how to teach price-forward earnings ratio in terms of growth unless we view the problem in terms of extending the basic model, which is the basic permanent earnings model, in which the only growth in earnings is due to retained earnings. So that's sort of a message. Setup of 3 dimensions. And basically what you're saying is the following thing. If we want to refer to earnings as being earnings, then we have to put analytical characteristics on what we mean by earnings. And this looks a little bit fancy, but it's just enough that we can handle it. What it really says is the following thing here is that if earnings are earnings, on the margin, everything really has to work like a savings account. That's really what it's saying. And we got to have aggregation properties. We do know that earnings add up. And then we have the foregone dividends here. So the basic idea is if you pay dividends, it's going to hurt future earnings, and we know what happens on the margin. And then earnings beget more earnings. In other words, there's sort of earnings secrete. On the margin, the more earnings you have next year, if you're consistent, the more earnings you should have the third year. And then the properties 3 and 4 are really extension for arbitrary horizons. You can do this for T horizons. So the key thing here now is the following thing. If you require earnings to satisfy these properties, and it's hard to visualize that earnings should not satisfy these properties, and you work for a third 3-dimensional sort of setup, then you must end up with the OJ model. From that point of view, the OJ model is unique. Once you have that, then you can ask the question, what should be the 4th dimension all about? And that actually also has some kind of resolution, but the key thing is that's sort of a little bit beyond what I'm doing today. The simplicity here of the OJ model, the fact that you're looking at an underlying principle, should alert you to the fact that other special models you're familiar with must arise as special cases, because the principles are general. So if you have some other model which is equally simple, which is also in 3 dimensions, it has to be special cases. So it turns out that the market-to-book model, which was talked about, which people are familiar with, it's actually just a special case of this setup. So it's, in some sense, it's not the competing model. We have a PEG model. It's also a special case. We have a constant growth model. It's also a special case. And in fact, even some of the simpler free cash flow models are also special cases. So what we're trying to do here is sort of develop a general principle about growth and growth in expected earnings. Once we have that general principle, then I can add on assumptions and other things that you're familiar with are going to fall out. Now, it turns out here that if you look at this stuff, most of these models, maybe except for the market-to-book model, can actually sort of be dismissed as having 2 intrinsic deficiency. The market-to-book model is actually kind of interesting because you don't have to write it in terms of the way of my second graph. What you can do is to think about the market-to-book model as explaining the price-forward earnings ratio, which is the proper way of thinking about it because it's really a statement to the extent that the company's profitability mapping into the price-forward earnings ratio is U-shaped. Companies with a low companies with a low profitability and a high profitability tend to be the ones that have high price-to-forward earnings ratio, whereas companies with average profitabilities tend to have low price-to-forward earnings ratio. So you sort of can fit this into the broader framework. But this is sort of how it works here. So basically, my message is very straightforward. You have to start from a price-forward earnings ratio without growth beyond retained earnings. Then you have to ask the question, if I add another dimension, what do I end up with? And my claim is that the only model you can end up with, if you have reasonable restrictions of what you mean by earnings, is the OJ model. After that, we can sort of build even more complicated models. Final comment here, and I think my time is up, I'm sorry, has to do with the fact that when you deal with these kinds of problems, there's sort of always, what's sort of a good model all about? And I don't want to go through the long story here, but I give you my short claim, is that ultimately a good valuation model is going to allow you to forecast analysts' revisions. So basically, if I look sort of upon a factual set of circumstances, I say, I have a good understanding of valuation, and I know the market is efficient. This is too good to be true. So if it's too good to be true, it probably is in fact the case. So therefore, it's really a forecast that what you're looking at is not accurate. So you have measurement errors in the expected earnings, and therefore you're going to have revisions in expected earnings. So ultimately, I sort of believe that tied in with Jeff's comments is that if we want to teach students useful information about equity valuation, one should have the tools to assess whether, in some sense, something is too good to be true, or something there's an opportunity there, and therefore you sort of get a good understanding of valuation. So I think this is sort of a natural thing. We don't have to look at the graphs, we have in my two earlier pictures. There are many, many other things we can do. Nevertheless, I always think that the starting point in what we're going to do in the future is going to be to explain the price-forward earnings ratio as it relates to earnings growth. Thank you.